There is no doubt that climate change has suddenly jumped to the top of the agenda. Headlines reflect a shift, the evidence that burning coal, petrol and other fossil fuels is causing climate change, and that the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions requires serious attention and urgent action. Why has it become so important so quickly?
The evidence of climate change has been around for quite a long time. We're seeing sort of drying in some areas, wetter in other areas. We're seeing glaciers go back. Quite a lot of people have thought, oh, this is just a natural phenomenon. But more and more the scientists have looked at it and tried to sort of attribute how much of this is just natural changes and how much of it is attributable to human causes. The latest assessment report, scientific assessment report that has come out, basically says there's a 90% certainty that's attributable to us, burning of fossil fuels over the last couple of hundred years.
Dr. Benjamin Preston is a research scientist in the Climate Change Impacts and Risk Stream of CSIRO's Division of Marine and Atmospheric Research. His research confirms that global warming will have a significant impact on our weather and ecosystems.
We're seeing very strong long-term trends in global temperatures. Temperatures have risen by almost 1 degree Celsius over the past century. And with that temperature increase, we've seen other changes. We've seen trends toward increases in extreme rainfall in various regions of the world, receding or melting of glaciers and ice sheets on just about every continent of the world. We're seeing changes in our natural ecosystems as species adapt, migrate, and redistribute themselves with the changing climate. We've also done work trying to attribute these changes to various sources, and our climate modeling, knowledge of the climate system, and the experiments we've conducted essentially tell us that we can't explain these trends or these changes without accounting for the greenhouse gases that humans have released into the atmosphere since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. These greenhouse gases accumulate in the atmosphere and have a net warming effect on the planet, which ultimately trickles down to affect the planet's surface and the oceans as well. In addition to that warming effect, there are also various feedbacks in the climate system that enhance that warming effect. So these include things such as melting of polar ice caps that reduces the planet's ability to reflect energy back into space, and that contributes to additional warming. And there are also other feedbacks associated with the terrestrial carbon cycle. Globally, we're projecting obviously continued increases in temperatures, and not only increases in average temperatures, but increases in extreme temperature events, such as heat waves, for example. In addition, we're projecting changes in a number of other types of extreme events, so increases in droughts, increases in floods, and potential increases in the intensity of tropical cyclones, which affect a number of regions of the planet. Most of the climate models tell us that Australia is facing a drier climate in the decades ahead, and this has obvious implications for water resources management, particularly in those areas such as the southeast and the coastal areas where population is concentrated and where they also represent prime agricultural lands. Australia's ecosystems are also at risk, so areas such as the Snowy Mountain regions, the Great Barrier Reef, and Kakadu in northern Australia have all been identified as some of the pristine, iconic ecosystems of the nation that are most at risk from climate change.
Despite Australia's unique ecosystems being at risk, Australians cause the highest CO2 emissions in the world per capita. With droughts and extreme weather increasing, there is now an urgency to change our habits to save the world.
There are really two things that we have to do with regard to climate change. One is climate change mitigation, so in other words, the reduction of carbon dioxide and other gases going into the atmosphere, and the other one is climate change adaptation. You have to do both. It's not a matter of just doing one. A lot of people have argued that we Australians are only 1.5% of the world's emissions, therefore why should we do anything? And I guess the metaphor I use is if you're all in a sinking lifeboat, it doesn't matter whether you have a thimble or a bucket, you better all start bailing. So you've got to do it together.
What we really need to do in order to get our emissions down is transition away from using fossil fuels and essentially using fossil fuel-free or carbon-free energy sources. There's a portfolio of options that are out there, things such as renewables, for example, are one of the prime candidates for a future energy technology that is emissions-free. There's also increased interest in nuclear energy and what that can mean in terms of reducing future emissions. But in reality, what we're going to see is probably a portfolio of different types of technology being implemented over different timescales.
So we're actually asking the governments of the world to do something fundamentally different, and that's cooperate and try and work in harmony. It's not going to happen perfectly on one day. I look at the Kyoto Protocol as the first step in a series of treaties that will go on decade after decade.
Kyoto is a very flawed mechanism, and the reason is that it imposes obligations to reduce emissions only on those countries listed in what's called Annex 1, which is a number of developed countries, developed economies. And the United States, back in 1997, in fact before Kyoto was signed, made it very clear through a unanimous vote of their Senate that they would not ratify a treaty that did not bind the major industrialising developing countries, in particular China, whose emissions will shortly become the single greatest national source of emissions in the world. And so the Americans said they wouldn't be in it unless there was appropriate commitments from the fastest growing sources of emissions. That never came about. America hasn't signed. There are no obligations on the developing countries. And so that's one of the reasons Kyoto has produced so little. After all of the fanfare, the result has been will be a 1% reduction in global emissions. Now that is nowhere near what we need. The other very important area of our work, which in some respects may be the most important, is the Asia-Pacific Partnership on Clean Development and Climate Change, and that is known as the AP6, and that's the major economies around the Pacific Rim where we are working collaboratively to develop the technologies that will enable us to reduce emissions in the future.
Look, I think government has a really important role to play, but I think we spent a couple of decades waiting for government to get the issue, right? And I think the reason the politicians, throughout 2006, 2007 have woken up to the issue is because the public is now ahead of them. So I think it really isn't time for individuals to act, and I think politicians are going to follow the people on this issue. So I do think there's a very important role to play for government, but I think if we wait for government, we're going to be in big trouble. And we need to lead the government and demand stronger action. And the best way to do that is to take action personally, right? If you take action, then you incorporate it into how you believe, your belief system. That becomes part of society, and therefore politicians will respond to that. So I think that's the order. So personal action is actually the most important thing to focus on right now.
It's very interesting to me watching how the Australian people have reacted to the issue of climate change. Up until about, you'd probably say October of last year, October of 2006, the Australian people, they knew about it, but there was just too much noise around the place. Then we had a few things happen. We had The Weather Makers by Tim Flannery. We had Al Gore's film, An Inconvenient Truth, a few scientific reports. And finally, I think the Australian people said, enough is enough. We're aware, climate change is happening. What are we going to do about it?
I was lucky enough to be selected to be one of 80 Australians that went and did the 3-day training with Al Gore in November. And that allows me then to deliver a presentation which is modelled on the Al Gore documentary, An Inconvenient Truth. And obviously, as a presenter, I'm modifying that to an Australian situation. And my commitment is to give 10 of those presentations to the community in the next 12 months. And the whole aim of this is to raise awareness within Australia of the broad issue, but also then to empower people at the community to take appropriate action. So you can see the US is doing pretty well there. A third of greenhouse emissions are coming from the US. China's accelerating. On this map, we don't look as if we're contributing a lot, but because of our very small population, we contribute a lot per capita. So this is emissions per person, and this is where Australia, on the left-hand side, we really do punch above our weight in this exercise.
Australians can directly affect 6 to 10 tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions per year. That is emissions an individual person can cut on a yearly basis. The Australian Conservation Foundation is one of many organisations working with communities across Australia to help them reduce CO2 pollution.
The Green Home program has been running for the last 2 years, and we've worked with hundreds of people across Sydney and New South Wales. In fact, at the moment we're working with Westpac and their employees to show them how easy it is to make these changes to help the environment at home.
You see, with energy efficiency, it's a battle you fight on many, many fronts, hundreds of fronts. So there's no one silver bullet. There's no one technological silver bullet. So it may range from replacing your incandescent lights with more efficient lighting. It may involve having more efficient appliances, hanging your laundry out on the line, using solar energy, dare I say it, to dry your clothes rather than putting them through the tumble dryer.
There's a whole range of ways people can help to contribute towards stopping climate change and slowing down climate change. One of the most important ones is certainly cutting your energy use in your home, because in New South Wales, in Victoria, in almost every state in Australia, we have primarily coal generating for our electricity. Tasmania's less so, but every other state's all about coal, and therefore you use less electricity, you use less coal. You burn less coal, you have less CO2 pollution. So that's a very important way to contribute.
So things like Earth Hour that WWF started, where Sydney was turning its lights off and flashing a signal around the world, also was followed up with a website called earthhour.org, which is still there, which shows you what you can do at home, bit by bit by bit. And they are all multiple and small steps. So awareness is key, action is much more important.
When we're faced with something as massive as climate change, the challenge for us is to say, well, if this is so big and so huge, how can anything we do make a difference? And on one level, changing your light globes doesn't seem like much, but all of us can make an important difference.
Families can measure their environmental footprint by visiting the Australian Conservation Foundation's website, which is acfonline.org.au, and there you can find out what your environmental impact really is. And from there, you can go to take some action to really make a difference. So that could be anything, for example, driving my car one day less a week.
But also what car you drive. You know, how you drive your car, how often you drive your car is a very important contribution. How do you get to work? You know, what do you do at work about helping other people to cut their CO2 pollution? Do you talk about this at work? Do you talk about this at your church? Do you get involved with your school and help kids to understand the issue? These are all very important parts of contributing towards a solution.
Energy used in the home is predominantly used for heating water and also for heating and cooling our space. So a good tip to keep in mind is when your hot water system breaks, look out for a solar hot water system or an instantaneous gas system, because that will reduce the amount of greenhouse gases emitted from your hot water system. Another tip is when you're looking for appliances, say for example a fridge or a new washing machine, you can look out for the energy rating labels and water rating labels. So the more stars, the more energy efficient your appliance will be.
In terms of making food choices, one of the things we haven't really thought about is where it comes from and how these food miles are incorporated into the actual cost of the food that we're eating. So if you choose to eat food that's come a long way, then there's a lot of greenhouse gas emissions associated with that. Now, making choices to eat food more locally and perhaps more in season is something our grandparents used to do. They didn't do it because of choice, they did it because they didn't have other abilities. But we can make those choices and still have, I think, a fantastic lifestyle.
A lot of the food we buy today comes from a long way away. One way to reduce this is to buy locally. This will reduce the food miles needed to create that food. And food miles is the distance that your food has come along. So for example, they did a study in the United Kingdom which showed that an average BLT sandwich, bacon, lettuce, tomato sandwich, had travelled 50,000 kilometres just to get to the average person in the UK. So you can imagine the greenhouse gas emissions which came from transporting that food.
But I guess another thing is to actually be out there in their community and helping out on community land care projects. There's lots of projects that are really helping to do something more than within your own backyard. And hey, give a land care group a hand, as well as doing something in your own house, in your own household and your own family to reduce emissions and help out in the community to get some great projects going that'll also do that too.
It's not just individuals and communities who have woken up to climate change. Australian businesses are also starting to take responsibility by reducing their environmental footprints.
Well, look, I think Westpac's doing a number of things, and all companies need to be doing similar things. And the first thing that we're doing is actually looking after our own footprint. So our own impact, if you like, on the environment. And that means doing what we can to lessen that impact. And so energy efficiency, that means reducing energy usage, direct electricity, paper consumption, travel, and so on. And managing those things both smarter and better. And to give you an idea about that, we've been at this for a decade now. And in the last 10 years, we've been able to cut our emissions by 45%. So a very deep cut in them. And that's been good for business. It's actually been good for our bottom line because it's reduced our waste of resources. But it's been really good also for the environment because it's made quite a sizable cut in our emissions.
But we have a range of programs, greenhouse friendly, the Greenhouse Challenge, which Westpac was a leading participant in, which are all designed to work with business and in particular work with the largest companies who are the largest emitters to make their use of energy more efficient, reduce the carbon intensity of their businesses so that our CO2 emissions overall across Australia are reduced.
I think people have really woken up to this issue in the last few years, right? So you think back when I started working on a consulting to companies in Ecos Corp, we started that in 1995. Companies in particular were really not engaged on the issue. It was kind of a question of guilt or social responsibility. Now you see a whole bunch of organisations, Westpac obviously, there's a whole IAG insurance company, Toyota. You see some very large companies deeply involved in doing concrete things around the issue. That's not yet normal behaviour, and it's not yet all companies by any means, but it's no longer a radical idea that a company would be involved in the issue. So I think the challenge for us now is to make that move on from the leadership companies to being all companies, of course, would behave that way. And so it's no longer unusual to behave in that way, and that's where I think we need to do a lot more. So we've come a long way, and I think symbolically we've really got strong leadership now from some companies in this area, but we're not yet changing behaviour across society. So the mind battle has been won, if you like, people believe in it, but we're not yet seeing CO2 pollution go down across the country, and therefore we need a lot more concrete action to happen.
And I guess if you look at it for any corporation, they should be attracted by the opportunity to actually boost the bottom line. And in our case, if you just take the last 4 to 5 years, it's in the order of $4 to $5 million of direct bottom line benefit just by reducing waste or being more efficient in resource usage. And so this is not doing it to benefit the environment at the cost to economic prosperity. It can be actually a mutual thing.
Within the Australian economy, there are tens of thousands of small to medium enterprises who really need help, and it needs to come generally down the supply chain from those who are bigger and more capable of leading. But in the end, all of us have to be involved. Doesn't matter whether you're an individual, the smallest of small businesses, through to the largest of companies. There is something you can do. Working together becomes key. We're not doing enough here in Australia. We are definitely behind the 8 ball.
A key objective is to develop the technology that enables us to capture the CO2 emissions and store them safely under the ground. Now, once you can clean up coal, then you can really have a wide range of low emission technologies: clean coal, wind, solar, hydro, nuclear power, and no doubt others. So then you've got a real range of technologies, but clean coal is a developing one, and we're putting a lot of effort into that.
One of the first clean coal technology projects in Australia is the Kwinana project, created by Hydrogen Energy, a joint venture of BP and Rio Tinto. Its focus is on converting fossil fuels into hydrogen to fuel gas turbines to generate electricity. The 500 megawatt plant proposed by Rio and BP would burn low-quality coal, turning it into CO2 and hydrogen gas. The hydrogen would be burnt to run electricity-generating turbines, with 90% of the carbon dioxide buried in underground geological structures in a process known as geosequestration. It could reduce carbon emissions by as much as 90%, taking 4 million tonnes of carbon out of the atmosphere each year, the equivalent of removing 750,000 cars from Australian roads. It will cost up to 3 times as much to build as a regular coal power station, and 50% more to run. So government subsidies will be necessary to keep the price of the energy it produces down. Ultimately, the success of clean coal will be dependent on putting a price on carbon emissions via a regional or global carbon trading scheme. New South Wales has one of the first functioning carbon trading schemes in the world. One of the cornerstones of the Kyoto Protocol, carbon trading will put a price on CO2 emissions based on a government cap of the amount of CO2 that businesses can emit per year.
So it's very important we see carbon offsetting and carbon trading as one of the mechanisms to drive pollution reduction faster and not as a way of avoiding behaviour change, because fundamentally we waste a lot of energy in Australia, and finding ways to reduce that is actually good economics as well as being good for the environment.
For example, say the company's CO2 emissions cap is set to 100,000 tonnes a year, and our example company has an actual yearly output of 70,000 tonnes of CO2. This means a surplus or a carbon credit of 30,000 tonnes of CO2. This surplus of unused CO2 credits can then be sold or traded on the carbon market, so companies will be able to generate income by reducing emissions. In our example, Company 2 has exceeded their yearly carbon cap by 10,000 tonnes, can either directly reduce their emissions or purchase 10,000 tonnes of carbon credits from the carbon market to offset their excess. It's estimated that carbon trading will grow globally in the next 5 years to be worth more than $2 trillion US. So the incentive to businesses to minimise greenhouse gas emissions will be substantial. This process of carbon offsetting aims to generate carbon credits. Carbon offsets can be created by businesses and households reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. Carbon credits can also be created through maintaining our native forests and regenerating previously cleared land. Vegetation, particularly trees, absorb greenhouse gas emissions, so there is an increasing need to create these forested areas known as carbon sinks to absorb and so offset the damage caused by CO2 in the atmosphere.
We've also announced a program to promote carbon sinks in Australia. So we've made the investment in forests that are planted to soak up carbon from the atmosphere and have to be kept in place for 70 plus years, so they can't just be planted and cut down after a decade. Those long-term carbon sinks are deductible as a tax deduction in the year of investment. So again, that's promoting biosequestration, as it's called, in Australia.
Corporates that are interested in offsetting their emissions really need to go through an audit of their own emissions, and once they've worked out those things that they can do internally to change systems or processes to reduce whatever they can, they often have an excess, and they really need to be finding other ways to help offset their impact on the world. And I guess Carbon Smart is one of those things that they can use to do that. They can, through land care, can help to do revegetation and basically creating sinks through trees through the Carbon Smart program. So not only are we helping out those companies that are trying to do something with their own emissions, but we're also being able to provide funding to landholders and communities across Australia that are doing the right thing and actually planting those trees, which will become carbon sinks.
I think the really exciting one coming, or we're in the process of now launching with Landcare, is something called Carbon Smart. And for the first time, we're really taking what will be the largest carbon pool in this country. We're going out to the agricultural sector, to our farmers, to really give them some ways to get ongoing income from regenerating, in other words, revegetating their land, so that they can put it into a carbon pool and have an easy means of which they can get an ongoing revenue from that. How that works is basically it becomes a carbon pool under an accredited system of which there are carbon credits attached to that, and those who have to produce the electricity for us or have to do manufacturing can go and buy those carbon offsets to help reduce their emissions, and so it's a win-win.
Carbon offsetting is not just for big businesses. Westpac has teamed up with Easy Being Green to help credit card customers help the environment. Westpac customers can use their credit card loyalty points to buy energy-efficient products or offset their CO2 emissions.
Right, so what we're offering now to Westpac customers is you can also use your points that you earn on your credit card to cut CO2 pollution. So basically you use the points to again go and buy CO2 pollution reduction from Easy Being Green, and then we'll go out into the community on your behalf and distribute energy efficient light bulbs, to put in water saving shower heads, to look at solar hot water, work with schools, work with a whole range of community groups to actually cut CO2 pollution. And so it's become in that way a product.